I'm going to do an intro. We're going to go ahead and start. So since the introduction takes a few minutes, that way we can get that over with. I want to welcome you. I'm Sandy Morgan. I'm the organizer of the Social Justice and the Economy lecture series. And as I always do, I want to take an opportunity to thank our sponsors so that they will continue to sponsor other things. And they are Ronnie and Richard Lippin, the Africana Research Center, the Department of African and African American Studies and Labor Studies and Women's Studies, the Department of Psychology and Sociology, and the University Libraries, and then the Rock Institute, Ethics Institute, with its very generous support that comes to them from Doug and Julie Rock. So you're going to look at my notes as I introduce you.
going to take you away.
Okay, I'm not going to be long, but I do want to remind you that there's one final lecture in this lecture series on the 16th of April. Do you know her? Sharushila S. Sharushila, Associate Professor of Women's Studies and an economist from the University of Hawaii, will be speaking on From Invisibility to Regulation, Southern Workers' Western Eyes. So I want to welcome you here to Penn State. We are very privileged today to have an esteemed scholar here. Nancy Folbre is a professor in the economics department at the University of Massachusetts, and I would say one of the most important economists working in the area of the non-market economy and care work and gender and the economy, not just in the United States but internationally. She's widely published. Her most recent book is a co-edited book called Family Time, The Social Organization of Care. And previously, the book just before that is the book that my class is reading right now, and really an amazing book, The Invisible Heart, Economics and Family Values. I think it's a tour de force, and you can tell that by all the amazing things that get said on the back of it by everybody, including Amartya Sen, the Nobel laureate. Aside from writing these fabulous books and many articles in journals, professional journals, Nancy Folbre also has done an awful lot of work in what I call, and what I guess she calls too, public economics, really trying to bring economics to the general public. And to that end, she works with the Center for Popular Economics at the University of Massachusetts. And there's a variety of magazines, Dollars and Cents, and books that have come out, including the ultimate field guide to the U.S. economy that came out, I guess, in 1999.
There's a new 2006 edition.
2006, so you'll have to go out and get it. And if all that isn't enough, Nancy has awarded the most, I think, prestigious fellowship that anybody could ever want, the MacArthur Fellowship, what we call in the trade the Genius Award. And it is an amazing, it's unrestricted. You can do whatever you want for 5 years, and you get a tremendous amount of money that allows people to do creative work that isn't always easy to get funded and to get time to do. And we are all better off because you got that money and because of the work that you're doing from it. The final thing I want to say is that I've been following this woman around for a lot of years. She went to the University of Texas 2 years before I did. She went to the University of Massachusetts as a faculty member about 3 or 4 years before I did. And now I'm very privileged to not follow you, but have you be able to invite you to be here with us at Penn State. We are going to hear a lecture today, Who Cares? Why We Need a New Social Contract, and I hope you will help me welcome Nancy Folbre. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It is a really great pleasure to be able to visit Penn State. Many people here doing work from which I have drawn inspiration as well as ideas. And I'm really looking forward to seeing if I can get you interested in the interface between feminist theory and political economy and the politics of care. That is my intent this afternoon. And I'm much more interested in the potential to exchange ideas and do a little brainstorming with you than just talking at you. So I'm going to try to go through my slides here in a pretty quick way and leave us plenty of time for back and forth. I do think that caregivers are superheroes, superheroines, and I'm very proud to be a part of what I see as a kind of upsurge in political commitment to call attention to care work and to value care work in a more thoughtful and more effective way. But what I'm going to do today is try to theorize a little bit and get behind the get beneath the surface a little bit and think about what we mean when we talk about care and how we could think about providing more support for it. So I really want to answer these 5 questions. First, I want to tell you what I mean when I say care and think a little bit about alternative definitions. Then I want to explain what I mean by a social contract and how past social contracts have ensured care provision, how the social contract is changing and why it is changing, and given that it's changing, our need to bargain over it and to try to change that social contract and get together and think about really good contract design. So those are the steps that I'm going to take you through. This word care is a very important word in every language. And in every language, it has a very complex, almost layered set of meanings. In English, care is both a verb and a noun. And if you go to the American Heritage Dictionary, which is kind of a nice guide to our American usage, you see that the verb to care is described in very positive terms: to be concerned, to be interested, to provide needed assistance or watchful supervision. But if you look at the noun care, it somehow the inflection changes. As a noun, the definitions are kind of negative. A burdened state of mind, is that arising from heavy responsibilities or worry, mental suffering, grief? And if you think about it, that's not surprising, because when you are concerned or interested in something, that can become a burden to you in a way. And this is kind of a paradox of care that I think turns out to be very important, have very important implications for social policies about care. So I'm going to use the term care to describe a commitment to help others. That could be a kind of state of mind, like caring about people. You're worried about them. You want to. You're there if they need you, right? Just to be there if someone needs you. Care also describes work, a process of actually spending time meeting the needs of people who need assistance. But care can also mean financial support. If you support a child, if you support a family member, if you help pay somebody's medical expenses, if you're hiring somebody to help take care of an elderly family member, that's also a form of care. So I don't want to ignore any of those 3 dimensions of care. I am going to define care work as the provision of services to another person in a face-to-face, hands-on, or a first-name relationship that implies some emotional connection and concern for that person's well-being. That's different than the way some other scholars define it. Sometimes care work is defined as work on behalf of a dependent, somebody who can't care for themselves. But I think actually it's important to realize that adults need care, and that care work is performed in the paid economy as well as the unpaid economy. It's provided primarily by women, but many men engage in significant amounts of care work. And I think it's this idea of attachment or concern about another person that's really distinctive. So obviously caring for a family member is care work, but being a teacher or being a nurse, a child care worker, an elder care worker, I think is to enter into a kind of face-to-face or hands-on relationship. That's a picture of me as a little kid with one of my caregivers. I like to start out with a little acknowledgement of the care that I have received and its economic significance. And maybe I also like to try to regain that kind of bright-eyed, optimistic look on the world that I had as a 5-year-old. Okay, so now let's think about care from the point of view of economics? What do economists have to say about it? What are some of its important characteristics? What distinguishes it from other types of work? And I like this image. It was a community art project at a women's studies conference in Korea, where anybody going by could write something or paint something. And so there's a lot of chaos in there, but there's also a heart, a word love, that word in pink, free, and a lot of bright colors. This is by way of kind of easing you into a more technical discussion of the way economists think about care. Here are some characteristics of care work that distinguish it, in my opinion, from services that can be efficiently supplied in markets. It's often very difficult to measure or monitor the quality of care work. One of the reasons is that care is very heterogeneous. It kind of depends on the relationship between the care provider and the care recipient. We could hand out evaluations for this lecture or evaluations for a teacher, but the average evaluation that a teacher gets is often not a very good indicator of the actual lived experience of interacting with that teacher. Some teachers may be very good with some students and very bad with other students. And what a student learns, in a sense, is kind of a co-produced by the teacher and the motivation or the effort that a student provides. Likewise, in healthcare, a doctor is not just somebody who knows a lot about medicine and can prescribe a good way of treating your disease. A doctor is someone that can persuade you to help her or him improve your health. That might involve changing your exercise habits, your eating habits. It's a collaborative process, and so the quality of a doctor really is not. It's heterogeneous. It depends on the kinds of patients that you're seeing, and your success in getting a doctor, your success in getting a patient out of the hospital may be very different than your success in improving that patient's long-run health. Just as your teacher's ability to help you do well on a standardized exam may be very, very different from the impact that teacher has on your motivation to engage in lifelong learning. So the measures that we have of quality are very imperfect, they're very complicated, and they vary a lot from person to person. There are large spillover or synergy effects with care. And I wrote in on the slide a parallel with immunization because I just read an article about the impact of immunization for the flu. It turns out that most of the people who get immunization for flu are elderly people who are particularly likely to be vulnerable to flu, and that's really good because it does help protect them against some of the negative effects. But most of the carriers of flu are very young children. And if instead we were immunizing the carriers of the flu, we would enjoy greater, what public health experts called herd immunity. That is, diseases would be less likely to travel in the population if everybody was immunized. And there are a lot of things about care that also work that way, that they spill over. If I do a good job as a teacher, then presumably the next year that student is in a class, there's a herd learning spillover effect. If you can persuade a lot of people to stop smoking, then that helps other people refrain from smoking. If you can change people's eating habits, there are benefits not just to them, but to almost everybody else. And if you can create a sense of being cared for, of being emotionally secure, and being, able to live in a mindful and balanced way in this world, that benefits everybody who comes into contact with people who are the beneficiaries of that care. There are coordination problems with care. That is, sometimes you find yourself in a situation where you're thinking, well, I would be happy to care for you if you would care for me. But if you're not going to care for me, I'm not totally sure I want to care for you. And I think probably you yourself have encountered in your own lives that kind of coordination problem, but I think it also exists on a larger kind of social scale. And if we could create kind of confidence that we would care for one another, we would be more likely to do that. But if we start being afraid that other people are not going to come through on their part of the bargain, if other people have a lot of potential to opt out or free ride on our willingness to volunteer care and commitment to others, then we're less likely to provide it. A lot of care provision involves insurance, especially for adults. What I mean by that is, what I'm hoping my partner will do for me is be there if if I'm in a car wreck. Or if I get sick, or if, my sister gets sick. There's a kind of informal insurance function that family members and community members and friends provide for one another. I'll give you an example that I think reaches beyond the usual kind of family network of care. I have a really good friend who's been about my age, a college professor, lives in a very rural area by herself, and was recently diagnosed with a very serious form of throat cancer that required a very difficult regime of chemotherapy and radiation. And what her friends did is used Yahoo to set up a group network with a whole care kind of infrastructure where if something happened that she needed help with, she could send out an email to 30 people who were able to thereby kind of share a lot of responsibilities for helping her out in a pinch, and could also easily contact other people in the care network. That's basically a form of mutual aid. That's a kind of insurance. And it's such an important way. It's so important to helping individuals make the best of an advanced healthcare system, that she can have all the best chemotherapy and radiation in the world, but if she doesn't have people who can help her get to the hospital to get that treatment when she needs it, then it's a very, she's not able to make the best of it. But whenever you have an insurance system like this, you have a lot of coordination problems and problems that economists describe with terms like adverse selection, crowding out. The Samaritan's dilemma is basically a coordination problem. I'm putting a lot of time and energy into my friend's care network, but do I really have any guarantee that when I fall ill that she is going to reciprocate? Implicit motivation is implicit as opposed to explicit motivation is very important for care. That is, people are not looking for immediate gain. They're motivated by love, by affection. And that's true even when they're getting paid for their job. Most people who go into teaching or nursing or childcare or elder care are going into it because they feel like it's personally important. It's a value that is precious to them. And as a result, the provision of care is very sensitive to changes in kind of social norms about what is the appropriate level of care and what do people owe one another. And it's also very much strengthened by personal attachment, by getting to know people, by forming kind of emotional bonds with people. And these characteristics mean that care is hard to simply buy and sell. Though we may rely on the purchase of a lot of care services, we can't just. It's not like buying a Coke. It's not like buying a new car where we know what we're getting and we know what the price is up front, and we have a kind of consumer sovereignty. It's a more complicated transaction than most of the things that we buy and sell. And that is exactly why social contracts and social norms are so important for care provision. The fact that we can't rely entirely on individual choices in markets in order to provide care. So, what do I mean by a social contract? Well, a social contract is just an explicit or implicit agreement that stipulates individual rights and responsibilities within society. And there's a long tradition in political philosophy of thinking about, of using this metaphor of a social contract to think about the way in which we stipulate rights and responsibilities. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau really made the term famous, but many other writers since then have used this language and have kind of drawn out the ways in which social contracts are individually and collectively negotiated. For a long time, this tradition of thinking about the social contract was very much focused on kind of voting and the sphere of the market economy, and it pretty much ignored family and sexuality. But one of the great achievements of feminist theory, and I inserted a little picture of Carol Pateman, the author of the Sexual Contract, is extending this notion of the social contract to relations between men and women and between men, women, and children and elderly within the family. And I think this is the area of feminist political discourse that has the most immediate implications for thinking about the provision of care. But I want to emphasize that the social contract is not something that is necessarily written down. We don't sign on some dotted line. There's a lot of disagreement about what our actual social contract is. If you remember, the Republicans used this language of a contract with America in the 1990s as a part of their electoral campaign, so there's no kind of political monopoly on the term where it's used by people on both the right and the left, very much under contention. But I think the interesting analysis emerging from the feminist literature concerns what could be called a patriarchal social contract. And this is a social contract that is apparent in many countries outside of Western Europe and the United States, but I want to focus on those geographic areas because I feel like that's an area where I feel like I'm a little bit better equipped to do justice to the cultural and legal and historical complexity of the term. I'm going to give you a pretty oversimplified version of it as it is, but I want to make it clear that I'm focusing on features that are part of our direct and indirect cultural heritage in the United States. Well, the patriarchal social contract was primarily a contract about care provision. Okay, parents raise children, children contribute to the family enterprise, they provide insurance for other family members, including support for children in old age. So it has an intergenerational component that is family specific. In that patriarchal social contract, women provided virtually all direct care services as daughters, wives, or mothers, and they did that partly because out of the goodness of their hearts, but also because there were very few alternatives available to them, and the exclusion of women from education and from from forms of work that didn't involve care basically increased the supply of care services available to family members. But men also were subject to pretty strong contractual constraints in this system, although the constraints were very different from those facing women, but men were obliged to meet the subsistence needs of women family members as well as dependents. That was a kind of part of the contract. But for the most part, men gained some asymmetric property rights and political privileges that gave them some kind of gender interests, what we would speak of as vested interests in the enforcement of that contract. For instance, until the final third of the 19th century, husbands in the United States had a legal claim over the earnings of their wives and over the property of their wives. And those gender asymmetries in property rights have extended up to fairly recent times, although now I think the explicit features of the patriarchal social contract are much weaker than they were in the past. And that's really the essence of my story. I guess before going there, it's worth pointing out that the origins of patriarchal systems are very important. Where did they come from? Why did they evolve? How were they developed? There are a variety of different theories about their origin. Some of those theories are based on kind of evolutionary biology, the idea that women had a greater physical and emotional investment in their offspring that made them very vulnerable to the threat of abandonment. So they're sort of willing to agree to a contract that promised them subsistence because the alternative might have been something that made it really difficult for them to successfully raise children. There's a lot of evidence historically that patriarchal property rights encouraged high fertility and population growth. It may be that societies that adopted patriarchal social contracts were able to essentially outcompete and shove away and marginalize groups that didn't adopt patriarchal social contracts. But however they did emerge, what we do know is that for most of written history in the West, we've seen patriarchal systems in combination with other social contracts in kind of hybridized forms that have been changing. And I guess my mental image of these giant systems is sort of the big monsters duking it out. You know, Godzilla is kind of the patriarchal social contract, and along comes a more high-tech robot version of this mecha Godzilla. And the two of them, obviously they have a lot in common. They're both really big and really powerful, and we don't really understand how either one of them works. But they are kind of batting at each other, and there's some tension between the two of them that is important and interesting to understand. So capitalist systems in the West emerged within a patriarchal matrix. Sometimes people call this a single system of patriarchal capitalism. Sometimes people refer to it as a dual system. Sometimes people call it a racialized gendered class system. Wow, there are a lot of different complexities to it, but I think what you call it is a lot less important than the way you think about its dynamics. You know, why does it evolve the way that it does? And one of the things that seems pretty clear historically is that as capitalism develops within a patriarchal matrix, labor markets tend to expand. The traditional patriarchal family is weakened in some ways. Fertility begins to decline. Education becomes increasingly important. Market income becomes a more important determinant of standard of living than it has been in the past. And in general, the shift to a capitalist market-based system encourages a lot of exploitation of non-priced resources. So just as competing firms have an incentive to use the free resources of nature or to spill over and pollute air or water if they're not prevented from doing so, there's kind of an incentive to make use of the non-priced resources of care and of care provision in the family without necessarily thinking about the long-term effects of that. So not all feminist scholars agree with this kind of historical narrative, but I'm prepared to defend it as effectively as possible. I think capitalism slowly weakens patriarchy. Both wage employment and fertility decline tend to empower women. The fact that women enter wage employment and gain alternatives to specialization in family care has some important implications. Women engage in collective political action. It's not the only form of collective political action. There's also a lot of class, nation-based, race and ethnicity-based collective conflict, but I think the emergence of organized feminism is a manifestation of collective efforts to change the patriarchal social contract in significant ways. But at the same time that there's this conflict, there's also a kind of dependency or a kind of accommodation between the two that enables them to live in the same house, as it were. Caring for dependents can't be completely shifted to the market. In most capitalist systems, there are kind of family wage systems that reinforce traditional gender norms and encourage a breadwinner homemaker family. The welfare state that is very much a part of the trajectory of advanced capitalism socializes at least some of the costs of caring for dependents. And a lot of the traditional responsibilities of the family, education, old age security, and most recently explicit subsidies for parents, these get taken on by the state. This is a famous ad, British Airways ad. I think it's meant to be a comment on the quality of care that apparently you could once get in first class on British Airways. But if you think about it, the ideal of maternal care and maternal solicitude is kind of a marker or an indicator of high quality care pretty much everywhere in the market economy. So if you look at current debates today about the welfare state, I think what you might notice, and maybe you'll have some examples from your own experience that you could plug into this story, but capitalism itself is often represented as a very masculine force. This is a software game, Capitalism 2, that you can buy, the ultimate strategy game of money, power, and wealth. And look at this guy, young guy, coat over his shoulders, sports car, on the edge of the city. I think it's actually a pretty good depiction of the cultural code that we use to talk about capitalism as a system. And the term that's often used for the welfare state is the nanny state. So this is kind of the wife in the marriage, the marriage of patriarchy and capitalism. The welfare state is kind of the wife. I think women find themselves often in a kind of uncomfortable and contradictory position within a patriarchal capitalist system, that they realize that if they take on responsibilities for care, they're going to be at a competitive disadvantage. They know if they go into teaching or nursing, they're going to get paid less. They know if they take time out of the market, out of the labor market to stay home with their kids, they know it's going to hurt their earnings. It's going to increase their vulnerability in marriage. They might end up being poor in old age. But what's the alternative? Is the alternative basically to give up on caring commitments, or to kind of assume a completely traditionally masculine role? Who is going to provide care if women don't provide it? And I think that coordination problem, and the fact that it's much easier for women to kind of decide to withdraw their care services than it is for them to persuade men to provide more of them, creates a lot of cultural and political and economic tension. Meanwhile, we live in a global economy where there's a lot of competition among countries and regions that creates pressures to lower the cost of care. Welfare states are sometimes described as very soft or weak. It would be so nice if we could have a better welfare system and a better educational system. But if we did, we would never be able to compete with other countries in the global economy. So we can't really afford to take that on. So there's kind of a neoliberal dilemma in the international arena, which is that we really need families, but we'd prefer not to pay for them. If people could just keep volunteering a lot of time and energy to raise the next generation, that's the best possible outcome. But there's a lot of reluctance to actually spending money on programs that would actually provide support for care work. So notice there's kind of an analogy with the natural environment. In fact, it's a very good analogy with global warming. Capitalism needs a stable climate in the long run, but in the short run, it's very hard to get people to agree on how best to limit the carbon dioxide emissions. Well, you could think of problems in the care sector, maybe you could even think of them as kind of social chilling as a counterpart to global warming. That is that we live in this increasingly market-based competitive economy in which people become more and more focused on their market income and their competitive position in the market economy, and just feel like they can't afford to worry about the quality of the family and community environment that they're relying on. And of course, globalization itself intensifies these pressures. At the same time, globalization provides some kind of temporary solutions to the care problem, because in addition to outsourcing a lot of our manufacturing sector to lower wage countries, we've basically, in the United States, used low wage immigration, and illegal immigration in particular, to lower the cost of providing care. Child care and elder care in particular in the United States, but also increasingly nursing and even teaching, are being staffed by low wage immigrants who are allowing us to kind of keep a lid on the increase of costs in those sectors. But there are some limits to the degree to which you can outsource care responsibilities. Mommy and Daddy have decided it's cost effective to raise you with foreign labor, so we're shipping you to Mexico. Well, it's easy to kind of make fun of the reasoning in this ad, but in fact, there is, this is happening to some extent around the world. I mean, the Japanese are facing such a serious problem with staffing care in nursing homes for the elderly that there have been discussions of moving their nursing homes to lower wage countries. Japan is in the vanguard of efforts to develop basically robot caregivers to care for the elderly, because the costs of actually providing elder care workers are becoming kind of prohibitive. If you go to Italy, a lot of care work in Italy is being provided by Albanian immigrants who will come and live in the household and take care of a sick family member and work for a very low wage, because the alternatives that they have in Albania don't pay nearly as well. I think probably the ability of high wage professional and managerial families to find immigrant women who will work as live-in caregivers has kind of reduced some of the pressure to solve care problems in the U.S. For some time. But I think there are really limits to this process. I think that capitalism needs the welfare state, partly because the welfare state is weakening patriarchal families. We have an economic system that relies heavily on human capital, that's very costly to produce and maintain. We're all living longer, that the elderly pressures of caring for the elderly puts new and unpredictable demands on care systems. Women have used a lot of their bargaining power to persuade men to take on more responsibility for child care and elder care. I think there's a lot of evidence that is taking place. And so now men, as well as women, kind of have a stake in thinking about the overall efficiency of our care delivery system. And finally, speaking kind of as an economist, it's just more efficient to coordinate care through the welfare state than just to have these sort of temporary ad hoc casual arrangements that don't always guarantee very high quality. So I think that there is actually a lot of momentum behind this process of thinking about care provision. So I think one evidence of this political momentum is the political discussions now emerging within the Democratic Party about the need to spend more on health care, child care, elder care, and so forth. And I thought I'd just give you an example of a couple of recent articles that have explored these issues in more detail. This is a cover of The Nation, which ran a great piece by Ruth Rosen on the care crisis, how women are bearing the burden of a national emergency. It's basically arguing that as women have moved into paid employment, the pressures of continuing to meet responsibilities for unpaid care have become very difficult, particularly for low-income families. And emphasizing that this needs to be brought to the front and center of the political agenda. Here's another example of an article from the American Prospect, Motherload, why can't America have a family-friendly workplace? And you can go here to the American Prospect and get a very good kind of rundown of the kinds of specific policies that are now under consideration. Paid sick leave, the Healthy Families Act is moving through Congress, I think, this very week. Paid family leave for both mothers and fathers, reduced penalties for part-time work, provision of high-quality, publicly subsidized child care, universal health insurance, care credits through Social Security, long-term care insurance. These are all very costly policies, but they're all policies that could potentially improve the overall quality and quantity of care services in the economy as a whole. And I think that it's very important to use the language of economic efficiency to try to make a case for them. Basically, what this is about is bargaining to change the social contract, bargaining for more attention and more public support for care. And I wanted to mention a couple of books that have been written by Penn State faculty that touch on these issues. The Taxes Are a Women's Issue, Reframing the Debate, that Mimi Abramovitz and Sandy Morgan have just published, is a really great guide to understanding taxes and how they affect this picture. Bob Drago's new book, Striking a Balance, Work, Family, Life, talks about a care gap. And a new book that Stephanie Greenwood is editing called 10 Excellent Reasons Not to Hate Taxes. I think the lessons from theory that I would kind of summarize, that I maybe have just touched on here, are that there's money involved. Everybody wants to get care, but nobody really wants to pay for it. And a lot of distributional struggles over the welfare state are basically about who's going to pay for the kids, who's going to pay for the elderly, who's going to pay for the sick. And I think if we understood that better, we could negotiate better and have a better understanding of where the resistance to providing more public support for care is coming from. The fact that there is this distributional conflict means that we need to think about building coalitions to see where common interests lie in renegotiating the social contract. And I think rather than having these isolated group constituencies in favor of child care or elder care or health care or improving education, we need to pull people together and say, look, what we have in common is that we're worried about provision of care, and how can we work together, and how can we put together a package of policies that could help build public support for care. Building alliances between workers and consumers. In a lot of care jobs, we see that care workers are paid very poorly, and they have a hard time staying in jobs with poor working conditions and low pay. As a result, consumers get very low quality services in child care and elder care. There's a lot of economic literature that shows if you can pay higher wages but get higher quality in return for those higher wages, you're better off. Your actual per unit price can actually go down with higher wages if you can improve productivity and quality. And I think there's a lot of potential for that in the care sector. I don't think we can make the argument wholly in terms of economics, that there are important human rights dimensions, there are intrinsic benefits from providing more care as well as efficiency gains. But I think a lot of it will come down to taxing and spending, and what that means is that advocates need to understand how the tax system works and how it doesn't work and how to go about fixing it. I have a couple of ideas about that we can talk about more in the questions and answers, I hope. And then finally, it's not just about policies or laws, it's also about norms. It's also about that implicit contract, who owes what. Should we be upset that the latest report from the United Nations shows that the U.S. is at the rock bottom along with Great Britain in terms of quality of life for children? should we be concerned that poverty rates among children in the U.S. have been going up? Yeah, I think we should. I think we need to. This is a social norm, I want to insist that child poverty is not something that we should tolerate. And I want to figure out how to persuade as many people as possible that we shouldn't tolerate high levels of child poverty. So finally, I'm going to end with this is a photocopy of one of my students' blue books. I just think it kind of made me feel good. He was using the passive voice here, which is the thing that college professors correcting their students' writing most like to criticize. And it is kind of a crazy way he framed it, right? If the future wishes to progress further, as though the future were some sentient being, there needs to be more done. It's not quite clear from that description who would do it. But the spirit of it is right. If the future wishes to progress further, which I think it does, we need to do something about it. We need to take action. So I hope you have some ideas about how to do that. Thanks.
So many of you know really you've been here before. What we do is, because this is being televised, you just put your hand up. I'll carry the microphone to you, and we've got a good half hour to get down to the issues. So who wants to start? Jane?
Well, I guess I wanted to take up your challenge of sorts to talk about the claim that patriarchy, the weakening of patriarchy strengthens feminist possibilities. Because it seems like a lot of the talk would suggest sort of, maybe, for example, capitalism allows women to live without men, to be single, longer to be single mothers, but that happens, as much of the talk suggested, in market terms. So, for example, there's much less stigma today attached to being a single mother, but only if you can constantly prove your self-sufficiency. So still there's a lot of stigma attached to being a welfare single mother, not to being a middle-class single mother.
Yeah.
So patriarchy has weakened in that sense, but it really, as you say, the value of care has not any more value now than it ever was, perhaps less in some ways. So I guess my question is, if many of the solutions come in economic terms, then are we ever going to get to a point where care is really valued, when the primary value in an economic rubric is autonomy and self-sufficiency and singularity? Is there any way to approach it from another perspective so that the intrinsic value of care comes first, and we see if that can be deployed with primacy, rather than beginning with the economic and hoping that makes people change their minds eventually about the value of care?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very nice way of framing the issue. I think there are probably many possible strategies, and I think we should be thinking about all of them. So I don't want to kind of put all my eggs in this one theoretical basket. On the other hand, I think that history is a very big and powerful thing, and we are kind of little mice. And there are these big monsters. There really are these big monsters that are kind of fighting things out. And what that means is that we really have to be able to understand and exploit their conflicts and their differences, and to figure out a way to benefit from the conflicts or contradictions between them. I also think it's really easy in our current historical conjuncture to be very dispirited about the future the future of our society, and I actually think that we can look back to some very important gains that women have made as women by successfully and collectively changing the social contract. I think there have been important gains in public provision for care. I think public education is a huge gain. I think the expansion of public education to the post-secondary level that's represented by state universities, like the one I teach at, is an example of an important gain. I think that state support for early childhood education is moving forward in important ways. I think the state Children's Health Insurance Initiative that has extended Medicaid coverage to poor children represents an important gain. I think capitalism requires care provision, and that gives us some bargaining power that we should be thinking about how to take advantage of. Now, I think it's a hard process, and I think that I completely agree with the first part of what you were saying, that is, more gains have come to women to women as women than have come to women as caregivers, and that women who take on responsibilities for the care of others are still in a particularly vulnerable position. But I do think that they need us. You know, they have to negotiate with us, and it's basically kind of the willing participation of women in the kind of existing social contract that makes the system viable. So I think that reinterpreting it in a way, if we could find a language and a set of images to better explain how profoundly destructive of human capabilities the current social contract is, I think we could change it.
I have two things to, I guess, ask, and that is, you mentioned that capitalism is slowly weakening patriarchy,
Yep.
but I can see the opposite being played out as well. Just with capitalism, like I guess within like the media, like how businesses are becoming more connected with one another, like the acquisition of power being concentrated to one individual instead of like other people. So I just don't understand, like,
How does that weaken? I mean, what does that have to do with? Why is that inconsistent with weakening patriarchy?
because I think in a sense it's strengthening it, because I guess people like I guess individuals are having more power over certain issues instead of it being like more evenly distributed, like through the.
Right. I guess I would say I think there is kind of a concentration of wealth and a concentration of
Yes.
political power that's going on in the U.S.
Yes.
But I think actually that's different from. I mean, actually, women are playing an important part in that. Women are playing a more active role in that kind of upper echelon of wealth and power. And I think it's precisely, one of the reasons that class and race inequalities are becoming more pronounced in the U.S. is precisely because gender inequalities have become somewhat less pronounced.
Okay, and my second question is, how do you feel like with children being put into childcare at a young age, and their parents are increasingly playing less of a role in their lives, and they're being raised more by state institutions rather than a more nuclear family institution?
I don't think that's an accurate statement of what is going on. I think that we're relying much more on institutional provision of childcare. I think there's a lot of evidence that it's really good for kids, especially if it's high-quality care. And there's also a lot of evidence that parents don't reduce the time that they spend with their children hour for hour with time in childcare. What they do is they reallocate their time and spend more time with their kids in the evening and on the weekends than they did before. So a lot of the use of institutional childcare is actually increasing the total amount of time of active care time that children are getting, and there's a lot of evidence that it's really good, especially for children, toddlers and up. On the other hand, I think there is some evidence that children under the age of 6 months can suffer some adverse effects from being in institutional care, and one of the adverse effects is that they're not as likely to be breastfed. And it's sort of an amazing fact in this day and age, but there are still huge health benefits to young children of being regularly breastfed at least to the age of 6 months. And there's this huge socioeconomic differential in this. Poor women in the U.S. cannot afford to breastfeed because they have to go back to work in order to be able to support themselves and their families. So that the higher the woman's income and education is, the more likely her young children will be breastfed, and the more likely that she'll be able to stay home and care for them until they're 6 months or older. But I think an important part of this progressive feminist policy agenda that's emerging is to insist on paid family leave for up to 6 months for both mothers and fathers. And that could address some of the concerns that you were expressing about institutionalization.
Yeah, it's just a concern of mine that there would be an increasingly difference in upbringing for the child, and that they would be given certain messages that perhaps their parents would not want for their child.
So do you have kids?
No.
So when you have kids, are you going to take some time off from paid work to stay home and take care of your kids?
I personally don't know if I want children, but yeah. I know, from what my parents did not want me being raised by the state, I guess you could say.
I guess I'm just struck by the fact that a lot of my students at UMass, the guys, they do tell me that they really want to spend time with their kids, and they really want to be active dads, and they really want to take time out from paid employment to stay home with their kids. Now, I don't know that they're actually going to do it, but I think there is a changing cultural norm. And I think it's a very positive change, and that's exactly what I'm talking about. I don't think... I think if we portrayed this issue of improving care totally in terms of state services, I think it would be a complete loser. Because what we need is a balance between public provision of services and time for family and community and neighbors to help one another. Right? We need both of those things together. But can't we do that? Can't we package them in a way? A better way than we're doing today. I think we can.
So you're speaking of more a community impact than rather institutionalized impact.
Well, I think we need both. I want to have really good high quality childcare, and I want to have really good jobs that you can, make a decent living at, working 25 hours or 30 hours a week. Yeah, and we can do that. It's within our power. We have the policy tools that we need to do that, But we sort of, there just hasn't been much active effort to think about how to build that.
So as a father and a family where both parents are working, I concur that there is a desire for more time to be spent. Flexibility is key, and we're able to do that given my job is at the university, but I think there's a bigger debate about lifestyles and types of jobs that afford that flexibility. But my question is a totally different one. I want to go back to the topic of the relationship between care and the welfare state. Mm-hmm. In the previous slide, it mentioned something about forming coalitions and alliances. Mm-hmm. Can you speculate, I guess theoretically, how we begin to look at this relationship? Or I should say, what types of opportunities and challenges are posed by changing notions of the welfare state when it seems to be moving toward one that has to do with care for the volunteer military? So does this shift of the welfare state in terms of care for the military volunteer military, does that begin to provide opportunities for this overall shift for care, or does it present challenges in terms of the reframing of care?
Well, I'm not sure I understood exactly what you meant by the armed services. But I think it is interesting that the armed services have been in the forefront of providing really comprehensive care services. They provide, the best child care system in the United States is provided by the armed forces. That's because they ensure really high quality. They have regular inspections. It's highly subsidized. It's widely available. And I think the Army has also, except for the most kind of recent scandals about Walter Reed in particular, and certainly there is very uneven treatment of people there. In general, the Veterans Administration and the health care services provided by the military, and also the educational subsidies provided by the military, they kind of make my point in a way.
Yeah, I guess
that it's useful that why is the Army doing these things? Because they've figured out that they can utilize their person power more efficiently if people are healthy, if they don't have to worry about their kids, where there's some effort to help them coordinate their family work conflicts. And so I think that's a good example of the efficiency, quote unquote, efficiency gains.
Well, just to clarify, I'm not talking about the future in the passive tense. Going back to the statement up here.
Yeah.
In the future, do you think there will be some privileging of care by certain populations over others? So if I seeking care and I went to some battle in some territory and come back, there's going to be some debate and framing about who gets more care depending on notions of citizenship, which goes back to the social contract.
Yeah, absolutely. Look. If you're in a wealthy, powerful group within society, obviously you want to exclude people from your circle of responsibility that might need expensive care, and that's kind of the privatization strategy that we see taking place, is people kind of buying out of the public school system, buying out of public health care. Yes, there's tremendous economic incentive to break off from and absolve yourself of responsibility of the people who really need care. In fact, the nation state itself, the fact that the welfare state is based on the nation state is a very good example of that externalizing behavior. After all, where is most of the child poverty in the world? It's not within this country. It's in other countries for whom we are willing to accept very little responsibility. So the whole story, yes, there is a tremendous amount of distributional conflict. But it's such a bad idea to give up and say, it will ever be thus. There will always be rich, powerful groups who are claiming the resources and trying to exclude everybody else from it. The whole spirit of the enterprise is to persuade those groups that they have more to gain by a more cooperative system. It's like immunization. Yes. If there's an infectious disease raging through society, you can go to your island, fortress and cut yourself off from the rest of society. But it's not that expensive to just immunize everybody against the disease. It's the same logic in thinking about, the inefficiency of the welfare state. If you let children grow up in terrible conditions of poverty, they grow up. They don't graduate from high school. They don't become productive workers. They end up in jail. It costs more to keep a person in jail than it costs to send them to Harvard. There are all these social costs that are borne by the overall inefficiency of the system. And, we should be, this is our job. This is our job as social scientists, is to design a better care contract that's so good that people can't, that people can be talked into it. And, maybe we can't do it, but, damn it, we ought to be trying. Why aren't we trying harder to do this? Let's just give it a try.
Malika?
I had one comment that was related to the child care and then a question. And that I think goes back to what you said, just because they're at home doesn't mean they're getting quality child care. is one thing.
Yeah.
Because you also have to think of, traditionally when children stayed at home with parents, it was not a nuclear family, so they didn't spend time only with the mother,
That's
but there
right.
were lots of others. And just anecdotally, I come from India, and my mother is always amazed by how much time my son gets one-on-one with me and my husband versus what we got with a stay-at-home mother.
Yeah.
So there are lots of other things embedded in it, just the notion that if you're in the nuclear family and stay-at-home mother, that it's the greatest child care is, I think, kind of a hoax on this country sometimes. My comment was, and I just wanted to, you posed the question that, and you said like the neoliberal dilemma being, we need the families because we need the labor, but nobody's willing to pay for it. And in the short term, that by the inequities in, I guess, the North and the South and those kinds of things, we are farming out or bringing in some of the people from elsewhere
Yeah.
to do the work, the care work at a lower rate. Do you think one could make the argument that with time, if the differentials in the standard of livings between the North, South, and the other countries were to decrease, that would no longer be something which would happen? And so in the kind of long term, this is a short term thing. So kind of the entropy kind of thing you're leading towards is where you have to start by necessity, not by any egalitarian needs or whatever.
Yeah, it's
go
very-
that route.
Yeah, thank you. I think you put that very well. It's a little bit like global warming. People can ignore it and ignore it and ignore it, but pretty soon the economic consequences become so overwhelming that the pressure to act is very great. Now, of course, it can be then very costly. It may not be successful, but there will be mobilization around it. And I think it's a similar thing that we are undergoing. We've undergone very rapid social change over the last 300 years. We don't understand it very well. There are a lot of unanticipated consequences. There's a lot of distributional conflict, but there's also just a lot of just plain old ordinary stupidity. We just haven't figured it out yet. And I think that it could be a very long run process, and I think we need to see it as a very long run process, but we need to start working on it as soon as possible. And that's what we're doing as we speak.
I wanted to say a little bit more about what he was saying before about the weakening and strengthening of patriarchy with capitalism. And I feel as though sometimes, especially in class, we get kind of a conflicting message about whether or not capitalism is strengthening or weakening patriarchy. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe what we're talking about is kind of, for certain classes of women, it weakens patriarchy, and maybe for other classes it strengthens patriarchy. I was just wondering if you could comment on how that would happen, because when you said that women are part of like the dividing wage gap and the huge accumulation of wealth amongst a few people, I've always kind of gotten the opposite impression. So I was just wondering if you could talk about, for different classes of women, how maybe patriarchy is being weakened or to a lesser extent.
Well, I would make a distinction between patriarchy and inequality. I mean, I think capitalism is intensifying many forms of inequality, or at least the period of capitalist development that we're going through right now. And not just in the U.S., but in Europe and in China and India as well, is intensifying inequalities. And I think it's intensifying inequalities based on education and on it's also fueling a lot of racial ethnic conflict that's having very negative effects. But I think it is undermining patriarchal property rights. It's undermining the legal asymmetries between men and women have virtually been eliminated in the U.S. And there are many countries in the world where they haven't been. But in the U.S. and Western Europe, I think you would be hard put to give me an example of a significant legal asymmetry between women and men. There's still a tremendous cultural double standard that I think puts women at an economic disadvantage. And I think part of it has to do with this sort of relationship between femininity and care. If you don't provide care, to not be a caregiver or to be kind of a caring person is to be defeminized in a way that puts women in kind of a double bind. But even that I see undergoing some cultural renegotiation. If you look at literature and film and popular culture, we now see a lot of images of women that have been very successfully dematernalized. And I think that cuts across a lot of class and racial differences. But I think the danger is I don't want to sound too optimistic about that. My optimism about the weakening of patriarchal relations is in a sense countervailed by my pessimism about increased class and racial inequality within the U.S. And I think that makes it a lot harder for us to renegotiate this social contract. That, in fact, if you look at, why is Europe so much more cooperative in terms of its commitment to improving the chances of the younger generation and taking care of the elderly? Well, one reason is that Europe started out as with a more equal distribution of income and a greater sense of shared commitments to the younger generation. And, the biggest obstacle standing between us and renegotiation of this care contract in the U.S., I think, is the incredible class and race polarization that has taken place and is continuing apace.
Can I follow up a little bit on this? One of the things that's so interesting to me is that we have, in the last few years, a convergence of two completely different trends. One, for poor women, of the mandated participation in the labor force, and the highly touted, if not numerically great, opting out of highly educated upper middle class women. And I don't know if that's sort of related to her question, but it does seem that the culture can handle this kind of schizophrenia pretty well. And people aren't flipping out about it, except for people like me that study welfare and say this doesn't seem right. But it's interesting how easy the culture has absorbed it. Now, I don't know how many women are opting out, but I do think it speaks to this question of...
Yeah, that's a good point.
If we can measure patriarchy, it may be that there's, on balance, no gain, no loss, because it may simply transfer sites from the household to the workplace, because in feminized workplaces, such as care facilities, hospitals, and nursing homes, there's often very patronizing and oppressive management regimes in place. So it may be net equal amount, but transfer a site from household to workplace.
Less inequality in the household and more in the workplace?
Not inequality necessarily, but patriarchy.
Well, say what you mean by patriarchy when you say more patriarchy in the workplace. You mean
male dominance?
Okay. Well, see, I'm talking about patriarchy more as an economist, like patriarchy in terms of actual property rights, laws, asset distributions.
Right.
The psychology of male dominance, the cultural kind of construction of male dominance, I think that is much more persistent. I think that takes a lot longer, in a sense, to challenge that than it does to just change who can vote or who has the right to own property or who has the right to gain access to professional education. But I still see changes. I still see a process of very uneven but still gradual normative improvement in kind of cultural acceptance of male dominance.
Yes. I was trying to account for why it might be confusing that you see capitalism bringing more patriarchy, capitalism bringing less of it. And just to comment on Walter Reed, those problems only started when they started outsourcing maintenance.
Yeah, well, I think
As long as it was in the hands of the Walter Reed, as long as it was in-house,
Yeah.
those problems did not exist. Only when they started outsourcing it did they begin.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important institutional observation to make.
Right.
Yeah.
The Army is a model of
Yeah.
the welfare state.
Yeah.
I wondered if you could speak a little bit further to the social movement aspects of the care crisis. You've alluded to it a little bit, but I'm curious from your observations of the larger scene, is this something that is being crystallized in new groups, new NGOs, new organizations, or is it something that's being brought in to lots of existing groups? And I'm particularly interested in how this maybe speaks to the issue of strategic coalitions, which you laid out in the slide previous to the last one.
I think some of it has to do with new grassroots efforts. I think a lot of it has to do with the changing political alignment of the Democratic Party, and I think a lot of it has to do with the increased importance of state policy initiatives as a response to Republican control of Congress and the presidency over the last few years. But you know, a lot of states, including my own, have been moving forward on universal pre-K and on universal health insurance. It's happening in California as well, and it's even happening in some states that, you know, you wouldn't think of as being politically in the vanguard, with the state of Georgia's early childhood education system, or North Carolina's Smart Start program. And, you know, when I go on the road and I talk at places and try to understand what is behind a lot of these efforts on the state level, it's an incredibly gendered movement. It is basically a cross-class, cross-race coalition of women in these states. And they have sat down and they've said, you know, let's get together. This is unacceptable. And they have figured out ways to build these coalitions. And I wish I understood it better or knew more about the details, but I do think that is what is happening.
You said you would, if we asked, tell us a little bit about your tax ideas for fixing these problems.
Well, let me just run one idea by you. It's not a practical tax proposal so much as it is a way of thinking about the taxes that we pay. I think one of the humbling experiences of the last 20 years of my life has been watching the tremendous opposition to increased taxes and seeing the tax issue used as a kind of bludgeon against any efforts to increase state spending on health, education, or child care or elder care. And I think that there is a reason for this that's kind of rooted in both our cognitive psychology and our national income accounts. That is, we know, most of us know what we pay in taxes, but we don't have a very good picture of what we get in return. And the right wing emphasizes that how much the taxes you pay in a given year. And they have this big thing about Tax Freedom Day, which is the day in the year after which everything you've earned, if devoted to taxes, would fulfill your tax obligation, so that after that day, you actually get to keep the money that you make. It's this idea of taxes as a confiscatory, theft. Taxes as theft. Taxes as confiscation. And I think we ought to turn around to them and say, calculate your tax payback year. How much money was spent educating you and providing roads and providing national defense and providing all of these services until you reached the age at which you started paying taxes? And how much more money do you have to go before you have paid back what has been spent on you? And that moving towards an intergenerational tax picture, that says that, look, we expect people to, we spend money on people and then they grow up and become adults and they pay into the tax system. In fact, we do need a sustainable life cycle accounting picture of taxes, and we don't have that at all. And if we could just move towards a better kind of national accounting system that could help people understand both the role of the taxes that they pay and the value of the non-market work they perform, I think we could change the way they think about expenditure of public money for things like public assistance to low-income families.
We have time for one more question, or we can say thank you, depending upon you. I think we're going to say thank you.
Thank you.